U.S. President Donald Trump has called Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy a dictator in a series of tense exchanges between the two leaders. Trump also blamed Ukraine for Russia's invasion and criticized Zelenskyy for objecting to his exclusion from talks between the U.S. and Russia. Zelenskyy has also suggested that Trump was being influenced by Russian disinformation.
For almost 3 years, Ukraine has been defending itself against Russian strikes. But this time, attacks are coming from an unexpected place, its ally, the US. President Donald Trump has blamed Russia's invasion of Ukraine on President Zelenskyy.
He refuses to have elections, is low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished? It's hard to be high. Somebody said, oh, no, his polls are good. Give me a break. A dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because...
Despite hitting back at Trump's accusations, the Ukrainian president is still counting on constructive cooperation with the US administration.
America needs success just as much as we do. Success brings us together. Our unity is the strongest safeguard for our future. A future not with Putin but with peace. This is a choice for the world, especially the strongest nations, to stand with Putin or peace. The right choice is peace. I thank everyone for their support.
Following a war of words between Trump and Zelenskyy, many in Kiev do not believe Trump is on Ukraine's side, but Putin's.
Ukraine is our country and it's our land. So why is it they who decide what we have to do and how we have to live? Why is it them doing all the talking?
It is equalizing the aggressor and the victim. It's not true and it's not, I think it's not fair.
The latest negotiations between Moscow and Washington has left Ukrainians feeling abandoned by their once strongest ally.
Our correspondent Nick Conley is in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Nick, the rift between Trump and Zelenskyy seems to be deepening every day, but Ukraine's leader can't really afford to alienate the U.S. president, can he?
Well, I think there's a sense here in Kyiv that they have to stand up for themselves, that basically doing what they did last week after Trump called Putin, and lots of things came out of Washington that the Ukrainians really didn't like, but they bit their tongues and hoped that they could basically reach Trump behind closed doors and, bring across their point of view. It seems like they've decided that wasn't working and they're going to have it to go public before some of these things that Trump has kind of launched at the world become kind of permanent talking points. We don't know how that's going to go. Obviously, this is a real escalation. That press conference yesterday from Zelenskyy where he talked about Trump being in that kind of disinformation bubble, you could tell Zelenskyy was very emotional, was very, basically had his heart on his sleeve, the kind of Zelenskyy that we saw more like at the beginning of the war. So that was indeed, seemed a little less controlled than lots of his kind of attempts previously to walk that tightrope between, keeping on Trump's good side and standing up for Ukrainian interests. We have seen since that kind of flurry of posts and statements yesterday, attempts to kind of reach out. We've had word that Zelenskyy was in touch with Republican lawmakers like Lindsey Graham, people obviously who are close to Trump, hoping that maybe that will work. Lots of calls to Paris and to London in the hope that that expected trip by Starmer and Macron to Washington, that will help somehow to rebuild these bridges. But we really don't know where we are. I think people here are braced for more comments coming out of DC from Donald Trump, basically picking up all the Russian talking points.
Trump's special envoy, Keith Kellogg, is in Ukraine right now. What's come out of his visit so far, Nick?
So far, we haven't heard a great deal from Keith Kellogg. When he arrived in Kyiv yesterday, he talked about listening, which obviously big contrast to what his boss in Washington has been projecting. He said that he was aware that Ukraine was expecting security guarantees. So I think there's still more to hear there. Whether or not he's going to come and talk to the press and risk being asked about Trump's comments is another question. I think the kind of, if you step back, the bigger question is how much does Kellogg actually decide? During the election campaign, it seemed like he was Trump's #1 person on Ukraine. He came up with a plan. But now, there are some sources saying that he's been sidelined and that he's basically only just in charge of talking to the Ukrainians, whereas Steve Witkoff, who's the person in charge of talking to the Russians, is maybe more influential in the Trump team. Certainly the Ukrainians noticed the fact that when there were talks with Russia and Saudi Arabia, you had Marco Rubio there, you had Waltz, the national security advisor, and Witkoff. So it seemed like a kind of more important delegation going to meet the Russians, and that the Ukrainian kind of part of the diplomacy, this visit here to Kiev by Keith Kellogg, seems a lot less kind of heavyweight in terms of the people on that trip. So there's a real worry here that they're just an afterthought, and that these talks, are being basically held between Moscow and Washington, with Kiev just kind of looped in, getting the minutes after the decisions have been made.
Well, Donald Trump has upended and halted humanitarian programs around the world. The funding freeze is adversely affecting Ukrainians, of course. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, USAID has provided $2.6 billion in humanitarian aid. That has now come to an abrupt end. Let's have a look.
This mobile medical team is going on one of its last trips. Leaving the hospital in the city of Tchiv, they are off to see patients in remote villages, all made possible with US assistance, but the project has been suspended.
We were supposed to travel on the 28th, but the day before we were told that the project was cancelled. We were scheduled to go to 3 villages, so we decided to go anyway. It would have been inhumane if they were waiting for us and we didn't come.
The team arrives to see one of their regular patients. For 84-year-old Maria Mefodievna, a visit from the mobile medical team is one of the few times she gets to see a doctor.
We did an ECG examination remotely. We did not bring a lot of heavy, bulky equipment, just the device that reads the ECG and a tablet. Then everything is stored in the cloud. We measured blood sugar and also cholesterol levels.
How can I get to the hospital? I have to gather a team to go to the district police station so they can take me out in a wheelchair. And I'm not just speaking for myself, but for the young and the old. The bus leaves 3 times a week. How do you get to Tchiv?
The mobile medical team is funded by USAID. They'll be able to keep the equipment they have received, including glucometers, a defibrillator and a portable ultrasound machine. But they can no longer work off-site. The hospital can't afford to fund the mobile team. The final house call is done. From now on, they can no longer visit patients in remote villages.
If it were possible to refuel our car and go to a bedridden patient, we would go. But you see, not everything depends on us. It's a pity that it depends on Donald Trump.
All they can do is wait. For now, the fate of these US-supported projects remains unknown.
Nick, what does the canceling of the funding for USAID mean for Ukraine?
Obviously, for people directly affected like that, it is a big blow. Ukraine has been the biggest single recipient of USAID support since Russia invaded in 2022. On the other hand, Ukraine is obviously getting a lot of support from other countries as well. So potentially, kind of percentage-wise, the impact might be felt a bit less here than in other countries that are more uniquely dependent on that one agency, that one stream of support. But we've had news not just from medical projects helping veterans are affected, cultural projects, medical projects. So it is a big deal. I think overall, though, finding money for Ukraine right now is going to be easier than finding military support. So the real worry, obviously, over all these arguments and kind of public insinuations from Donald Trump is that eventually he will start turning down the tap on military aid to Ukraine. And that is the thing that is very difficult to replace. Even if you have the money, buying some of these weapon systems, is very complicated. You need permissions. Even if you have the money, it's not always going to be delivered soon. So I think for now they can live with USAID winding down. It is devastating to lots of NGOs and small organizations, but the real worry is the military side.
Nick, thank you very much. That was our correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv.
Let's bring in DW correspondent Janelle Dumoulin in Washington. Hi, Janelle. As we've heard there, President Trump doubling down on his criticism of President Zelenskyy, calling him a dictator. Why has this turned personal?
Tommy, just to put this in context, Trump said Zelenskyy was a dictator without elections. At this stage, of course, important to remind our viewers that elections were supposed to take place in Ukraine last year. It's just that the country still finds itself under martial law because, as it happens, organizing free and fair elections in a time of war when the country is fighting for its survival is a really hard thing to do. But you were asking why this has all gotten so personal. And to be honest, I am hard-pressed to think of an occasion with Trump where it has not been personal. This is somebody who thrives on personal conflict played out over social media. He's especially talented at ad hominem attacks. And we did see Zelenskyy respond to some of his earlier ones by saying that Trump lives in a disinformation space, implying there that Trump has been parroting Kremlin propaganda. And we saw Trump react quite expectedly, quite viscerally to these statements. We know that he's sensitive to any notion that he might be an instrument of the Russians. However, it's also worth noting that beyond this war of words, Trump does have a habit of framing everything through the Trump lens, saying that if he had been there, the war would not have happened in the first place. Now that the war has happened, it will not be settled without his intervention. So the short answer to why this has turned personal is because with Trump, everything is personal.
And should we take that as an indication of official U.S. policy right now?
I don't think this is an official U.S. approach in the way that we traditionally understand policymaking, but it does tell us a lot about where Trump's mind is, what his goals are, and what he thinks should happen in order for him to achieve those goals. As such, functionally, they become policy. I also think we know a little something about how he views international norms and sovereignty. We've seen how he talks about taking over Greenland, annexing Canada, and the like. So I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that he wants to be seen as the person who was able to end the war, who was able to achieve peace in Europe. And I think the quickest way he thinks he should do that is by cutting a deal with Putin. Now, of course, the concern very much remains that this is going to be the kind of deal that is done over the heads of Ukrainians, that forces them into concessions they don't want to make, like giving up their aspirations to join NATO or giving up territory. However, of course, this is a sign of where Trump thinks things should go, at least at this moment.
Meanwhile, Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, is currently in Kyiv. What are we expecting from this visit in light of all that's going on?
Yes, this is a very interesting split screen. So you have Kellogg in Ukraine. He's talking about how we want to listen to the Ukrainians, how he is there for substantial talks. And you have Trump on the other side of the world appearing to want to undermine that mission. It's also worth noting that Kellogg was not present at the talks in Riyadh between the U.S. and Russian delegations, while the Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff was. And a lot of that seems to have to do with the fact that Kellogg is seen as much more pro-Ukraine. He's seen as much more of a Russia hawk. He's seen as somebody that has been advocating for more security guarantees for Ukraine. And as such, he might not have been a welcome interlocutor for the Russians. But what we are really seeing here is perhaps that Kellogg has been effectively sidelined. Trump clearly sees the Russians as the side to engage with, and it is Witkoff he's spent to speak with them and not Kellogg.
Okay. Janelle Dumoulin in Washington, thank you for bringing us up to speed.